Welcome to Supercool, the show tracking the rise of the low-carbon economy, a multi-trillion-dollar transformation reshaping global industries. Each week, we spotlight the climate technologies, business models, and strategies already cutting carbon, boosting profits, and improving modern life. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe or leave a review wherever you listen. And if you want to go deeper into Supercool climate solutions now scaling, check out our weekly newsletter. You can find it at getsuper.cool. This week, the International Energy Agency released a mid-year forecast. Global clean energy investment is projected to reach $2.2 trillion in 2025. That's more than double fossil fuel investment for the second year in a row. It's a staggering number, historic by any measure. That's capital flowing into solar, wind, battery storage, grid modernization, electric vehicles, and more. The most monumental wave of business innovation in human history is accelerating. Just look at solar. In April, solar energy generated 10% of global electricity, more than nuclear for the first time, trailing only coal, gas, and hydropower. Solar is now the fastest growing electricity source in history. Coal took 32 years to scale from 100 terawatt hours to 1,000. Gas took 28, hydro took 39, solar did it in just 8. That's the kind of exponential curve that changes everything. It means the low carbon future is coming faster than most people realize, but not fast enough. Not yet, anyway. Every week on this show, we explore the cutting edge of sustainability and climate solutions, showing you what's truly working to improve business and modern life by reducing carbon emissions. Solutions aren't limited by borders or technology. The world literally is their laboratory. On every continent where people live and plan for the future, you'll find real solutions already reducing carbon, boosting economies, and improving lives. Of course, some cities are further along the path to a low-carbon future. How? Almost always through bold, gutsy leadership. Someone decides the status quo is unacceptable. Someone declares change is coming, and with skill, luck, and tenacity, a transformation unfolds. What kind of transformation? Well, from a Supercool perspective, it's more than just cutting carbon emissions. What we're talking about is cities becoming more beautiful, social fabric strengthening, democracy deepening, and voter participation improving as communities connect. Neighborhoods are revitalized, economies flourish, and the shared civic pride and belief that tomorrow will be better than today takes root. Barranquilla, Colombia was an accidental city, founded centuries ago as a simple trading post at a river's mouth on the northern Caribbean coast. Its growth was fueled by waves of immigrants, people fleeing the Ottoman Empire, and 20th century European conflicts. Many found a new home in Barranquilla. Today, it's a city of 1.5 million people, with 2.2 million in the metro area. Jaime Pumarejo was also kind of an accidental mayor. After studying at Purdue and working for Ingersoll Rand in Nashville, Singapore, and New Jersey, he decided it was time to return home to Barranquilla. He joined city government, working for years with a team of civil servants who shared a vision for urban improvement. Then, in 2020, Jaime became mayor. His leadership became a master class in transformation. He didn't just, quote, plant trees. He forged a public-private partnership to integrate tree planting into the city's fabric. His inspiration? London, where tree-lined streets boost property values and tax revenue. Trees, Jaime told me, offer an excellent ROI. He did the same with parks, 300 of them, integrated into neighborhoods with community buy-in, transforming the city and boosting the economy. Similar initiatives followed for biodiversity and ecotourism. Behind these projects is a leader who secured financing for these next-gen climate investments. This is the hurdle for many cities, knowing what to do, but lacking the professional capacity and capital. So Jaime has now joined a global movement to change that. Today's episode is the third in our partnership with the Penn Institute for Urban Research, the Secretariat for the SDSN Global Commission on Urban SDG Finance. Jaime is on the commission advocating for cities to access the climate finance needed to build the low-carbon future. Now, many people today still believe solving climate change means sacrifice, that we need to rein in how we live, pull back. But there's so much evidence to the contrary. Evidence that shows that when cities move forward strategically and boldly on climate change, the future actually gets better. Block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city. Jaime's accomplishments in Barranquilla exemplify this. Here's our conversation. Jaime, welcome to Supercool.
Josh, it's a pleasure to be here.
As I was preparing to speak with you and talk about your work, of course, as Mayor of Barranquilla, the work you're doing on the global stage, the work you do with Breathe Cities, hearing some of your talks and speeches that are available online that were at award ceremonies or at the Atlantic Council, what triggered for me was actually a conversation I'd had on someone else's podcast recently where I was talking about climate solutions. And the host said to me, well, how would you respond to the alternative point of view that maybe we're spending too much time focused on climate instead of maybe other things we should solve first? And my reaction was, let me tell you about this company, D-Light, that operates in Africa, that brings solar panels affordably into homes in rural villages, low-income families across the continent. And in the process, does a lot for solving climate mitigation, but also starts to eliminate the use of kerosene for lighting or things that are really polluting and hazardous to human health. And so you want to solve for human health, you solve for climate. You want to solve for climate, you get these co-benefits of solving for health. And what struck me in having this opportunity to talk to you and the way you talk about your work and the issues that either come at you, like migration, which you've worked on and done a great deal with as the mayor of Barranquilla, or your work with Breathe Cities on air pollution and how that relates to other issues. Your work centers on this interrelationship very often between issues, among issues, solving for one, solves for others. That's a long preamble to say welcome and hello, but so thrilled to have an opportunity to talk to you. So tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming Mayor of Barranquilla, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Josh. I think my journey is a bit weird. I was very young, and my dad, when I was 8 years old, was actually the mayor of Barranquilla. He was a civil engineer, he was a builder, and that's what he dedicated his life to. But during a brief period of time, he decided that he wanted to run for office, and he was the mayor for a couple of years. And then he went back to being a builder. He didn't have a good experience of being a politician. He didn't enjoy it. And ingrained in my brain that there were other ways to help, because this was a tough and very demanding avenue or career. So I said, that's not for me. And I went to the US. I graduated from Purdue University. My first job was with Ingersoll Rand, a big multinational company that sent me to work in Nashville. That's my first posting. Then to Singapore. Then they sent me a while to New Jersey, to Annandale. And I quit and went back home. New Jersey was very, very different from my house. And so I said, it's not that I didn't have a good time, but I miss home. So I went back. At the time, the city was in a very bad place. It was in bankruptcy law. It had a trust issue, and poverty levels were more than double than what they were in most major cities in Colombia. And at the time, there was a candidate that was running. He was a very successful businessman, and he told me, I need help. I need people that are good at their job, that have passion, that really want to do things right. And I'm assembling a team of highly qualified people that have the audacity to take bold choices and to maybe make mistakes and to change things a bit. I was 26 years old and I said yes. And I started helping first in a part-time basis. And I ended up staying for 16 years, 12 as a public servant and 4 as an elected official as the mayor. And there was a stint when I was the housing minister for Colombia. So I think it was a very rewarding career. I got into it without fully understanding what I was doing. But once I was a public servant in the city, I understood that it's one of the best jobs in the world because you can really change things very quickly and you can make things happen for people. And during that stint, we really changed a lot of people's lives. Poverty is halved. Our inequality is the lowest in the major cities right now. We have the best school system, the best health system in the country of major cities. And all that happened in 16 years. So it was a weird ride. I'm not there anymore, but it was one where I learned a lot and I'm very grateful that I got to do it.
That's fantastic. I'm from New York. In my early 30s, I lived in Brooklyn, and I can remember, because I grew up with a lot of people from that area, and if New Yorkers go to New Jersey, never mind someone who's not an American goes to New Jersey, if New Yorkers cross the river and go to New Jersey, they tell you like you wouldn't believe, and they say it in a way where it's like, did you need a passport? I can appreciate that. And we lived in New Jersey too for a couple of years before we actually ended up moving south for different reasons. Give us some insight into Barranquilla. And the way that I'm thinking about it, what I've heard you talk about, which I found fascinating, was just the roots of the city was a place, I've heard you say it just formed, kind of because of its geography, that it became a place of trade. It was at the mouth of a river and then culture. But it's historically been a place that has grown in waves of migration. It's brought people from all over the world in very interesting ways. Can you tell us a little bit about your city in that regard? Because I know that that also plays into what we'll talk about in terms of what the climate issues are, let's say, that a city like Barranquilla faces versus cities in the US or elsewhere.
Barranquilla, to me, is very unique, and it's a very, well, it's a weird city, and it's good because of it. I guess a couple hundred years ago, Barranquilla was nothing but a trading post. It's on the mouth of the major trading river in Colombia, which is the Magdalena River, and therefore it's right on the Caribbean Sea. An hour north, you have Santa Marta, which was one of the major cities of the Spanish colonial empire. And to the south, less than 70 kilometers, you have Cartagena, which was the capital of the Spanish empire, per se. A lot of people don't know this, but in the 1700s, the English empire sent the biggest naval fleet of the time to try and invade it. And leading that invasion was a guy called Lord Edward Vernon, the commanding officer of Washington. And they tried to take over Cartagena, and they couldn't. But in honor of his commanding officer, Washington named Mount Vernon, Mount Vernon. And that was the second biggest naval invasion attempt done in history after D-Day in the Second World War. So anyway, that's 70 kilometers down south. Barranquilla is a major city, but when it started, it was a trading post where people would take their cattle to the river, where they would meet at the river mouth to trade grain and fruits, vegetables, and other things. We call it a city of the free because nobody founded it, nobody put a flag on it. It just started to grow because of this trading post. In a place where we were used to having cities formed because a conquistador put a flag on it or because somebody decreed it, this small trading post played a key role fighting off the Spanish so that they would not own the Magdalena River for naval purposes. And since that happened, the governor of Cartagena made it or decreed that it had the opportunity to become a town. And that's how the city started. But what happened is you saw that the settlers of the town were at first indigenous people. They were also African slaves that had fled from Cartagena and other places. They were people that were coming from Spain that were looking for opportunity, and they saw that place was going to have a big influx of people. And then you had waves of Germans. Then you have waves of Italians. Then you had waves of a lot of people from Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine that were fleeing the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And incredibly so, because they came with a Turkish passport, people here started calling them the Turks here. But they all became this melting pot of just a city that was everything and nothing. And people started to get along. And I think that's one of the nicest things about the city is that there's people from everywhere and we just get along. We found a way to coexist. And I think that's given us a very cosmopolite way to look at the world. We feel connected to the world. And just to give you an idea, to get to Bogota, which was our nation's capital at the time, you had to go upriver, and that was a 30-day journey. But you could get on a sailboat, and you could be 5 days within Cuba, Jamaica, or Veracruz in Mexico. So we were more connected to the Caribbean Sea and then to the world than you were to the interior of your country. So that gave Barranquilla that tone of, we want to be the doorway to the world. And that's what the city was at the time, and I think it's still trying to get back to.
Thank you for that. And when I've heard you talk about it, you talked about waves, and it was also in this context of migration. Yes, there was that early history, and then you had the Spanish Inquisition, you had people fleeing Spain, you had Jews fleeing Spain show up in Barranquilla. You had then in the 1900s some of the conflagrations in Europe. You're talking about Germans and others fleeing and persecution, and then the Ottoman Empire and all these people coming. And then the city started to grow. But we also started to have some problems, and we started to have a bit of an exodus of our own and went through that period. Fast forward to when you become mayor, and now you have the influx coming back. And you had talked about Venezuelans coming to your city. And I think that you gave a talk a couple of years ago. So this must have been either you had just stepped down as mayor, or you're still in your term, and you're talking about 10% plus of your population at that point was from Venezuela, which really struck me. That here comes this influx of migration for a whole host of reasons. You're talking about the breakdown of institutions, the breakdown of democracy, the breakdown of economic opportunity, all of which is going to be, to some degree it is already, and will continue to be exacerbated by climate change. So this is not going away. You were talking about how do you deal with it and what you did as mayor. So can you talk to us about, one, what you did as mayor, and two, how you see these issues? Climate, migration.
And as you said, Josh, Barranquilla was a city that's been used to migration in waves, but we hadn't had one in the last couple of decades with this big impact, and that changed our population so quickly. Because first we had a lot of people that lived in Venezuela but were Colombians that came back. But then we had Barranquilla as a city, roughly the city per se is 1.5, the metro area is 2.2 million people. And we got just in our city more than 150,000 Venezuelans in 2.5 years. From one day to the next, had to figure out how to get 20,000 kids into school. And we didn't have enough. How to get them into our health system. And all this was very hard. And I think one of the bold things that we were able to work with the national government, and I give a lot of credit to our former president, Iván Duque, who said, this is a crisis. Venezuela is our neighbor, and they've been our ally for years. And these people are coming over and they need a hand, but we can't just give them things because that's not sustainable. And Colombia is not a country that has a lot of things to give. So while we may be very conscientious and help them out, we need to figure something out quickly. And what was figured out is we gave them work permits, and we gave them the ability to have the same rights as a Colombian citizen for the next 10 years until they figure out what they want to do. And this changed everything. It changed everything because we were able to tell people, you're coming over, but we need you to pay your way. We need you to work. We're going to put your kids through school, but you're going to be paying taxes. We're going to help you find affordable housing, but you're going to have to abide by our rules. And that has been a huge difference. So there was a lot of help from the national government that gave us the ability to help these people get assimilated into our country. And I'll tell you something, just to talk about silver linings. Colombia's population is going to decline far quicker than Europe's and the US is. Our natality rate is dropping at a farther rate. So we're catching up to the natality problem, which I don't think is a problem. I think it's just something to figure out, because the fact that there will be less of us straining the world's resources, I don't think that's a big problem in the big picture. It may scare a lot of economists, politicians, and businessmen, but it doesn't scare the world. It doesn't scare the animals and the fauna and everything that needs to breathe a little bit. So in a sense, that's happening. And the Venezuelan families that are coming are having a lot of kids. And that's actually a good thing, because they are going to be coming into the workforce in the next couple of years. And what that means is people that are propping up our social security system. So they are buying us time while we figure something out. They are pumping billions into tax, but they are also pumping billions in to support the people that are going to start having a pension, and who's going to be working for them? These new immigrant families that are younger and are making the babies that Colombians aren't. I think that is important. Now, where does this intersect with climate? It intersects with climate because people that come into cities don't have the ability to pay for the best housing. They don't have the ability to look for the places where there will be no landslides, where there will be no floods. And what happens is the places where you normally have landslides and floods, is the biological hotspots, the biodiverse hotspots, the swamplands, the places in the mountains, those where people look to have their informal housing erected because that's the places they find. So what will end up happening is you will end up having a triple crisis. One, you will see biodiversity displaced and eroded. Two, you will then have an informal settlement in a place where they are prone to landslides and more flooding. And then at the same time, you will know that those will become migrants in a couple of years when that catastrophe hits. So it all comes into play, and you need to think about all of these things when you're planning what you're going to do with the migration problem and what you're going to do with a climate change problem, which is very palpable. And I'll just give you this example. 12 years ago, we had the worst rain season of our history, the last 100 years. And we had 30,000 people that were displaced or families that were displaced. Fast forward 10 years later, which was 2 years ago, we had the worst rain and flood season of our history. So the 100-year storms came in 10 years, and that's not normal. That's climate change, and it's real. And what happened is, because we were able to adapt and mitigate, only 3,000 families were affected, and in a lot less way. So climate change adaptation and mitigation is possible. I think they intersect and interconnect that way, and that has been the challenge last year.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one of the beautiful things I heard you say when you were talking about absorbing 150,000 Venezuelans and 10.6% of the population had suddenly become Venezuelan. It was a saying that I'm glad you translated because I wouldn't have understood, but you had talked about watering down your soup.
Yeah.
Right? We know that it won't be enough, but it will help us pass through the night. We're going to share. We're going to house people. We're going to give free meals. We're going to put them in school, and we're going to put them to work. Everything you just described, I found that was just such a wonderful sentiment. One of the things you've said that I didn't realize, but I think is also helpful in talking to you, is that when you look as a mayor thinking about climate leadership, thinking about what it means for your city, thinking about it now, I know you work on a global stage, but when you did, let's say, an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions per citizen, of a citizen of Colombia, which when you said it may have shifted, but it was about 1.6 tons of carbon per year per Colombian versus, say, 15 tons of carbon per year in the lifestyles we lead here in the US. And so it raises the question, well, what does it mean to take action in a country like Colombia or a city like Barranquilla, where it's really less about, yes, mitigation is part of it. We got to bring down carbon, but what else how do we need to be thinking about the climate crisis, and what is our role? You've talked about preservation, you've talked about conservation, biodiversity. Can you share your perspective on that?
Yeah, there's a conflict in the world right now, and the global north, some countries get it, some don't. Some countries are doing more, some aren't. And the fact is that countries like the US, China, Russia, a lot of countries in Europe that have not put up their fair share are causing climate change because of the industrialization that they have and the choices that they've made. And then there are the ones that are receiving the blunt edge or the rough edge or the sharp edge of the knife of climate change, which are the cities in the equator. And what that traduces into is more rain or less rain. It traduces into this year, Florida and the Caribbean will have the worst sargassum season in the last couple of decades. I think it's 30% more than the last one. So there's going to be a loss of tourism. There's going to be a loss of economic opportunity. And there's going to be a huge cost. And it's going to be a problem in the beaches and for biodiversity. And this is all attributed to climate change. I mean, it's not a disputable fact. This is the reality. Things are changing, and we are accelerating that change. Colombia, as you said, if we were to take a measure, more or less 14 Colombians amount to the emissions of one US citizen. So that's a big difference. And we're saying we need it to stop, but we're not the culprits. What should Colombia's goal be? We have a big responsibility in the world because we're one of the most mega diverse countries in the world. In one tree, we can have more than 120 types of ants. In a square acre, we can have more than 100 types of butterflies and frogs and birds. So our responsibility is to care for that. And a lot of people don't understand. And why is that important? Well, a lot of our medicine and our science comes from biodiversity. Ozempic and the great miracle of semaglutide came from biodiversity. It comes because we understand, study, and use the animals and the plants in a sustainable way. So the Amazon rainforest and the paramos and the mountains, all this houses a huge reservoir of a treasure. It's a green treasure. And what Colombia must and should do is preserve that. So our goal is not to drop emissions because we don't have a lot. If we were to shut down Colombia's industrial system, nothing would change in terms of climate change. What we need to do is make sure that our waters, so our rivers and our oceans, are protected, and that our rainforests and our dry tropical forests are protected as well. And Colombia, on paper, is protecting more than 40% of its land, but we have a lot of troubles and pressures from illegal mining, from the illegal drug trade, and from others that use or hide in illegality. So there's a lot of resources that need to go into that, but there is also a lot of conscience building that needs to go into making our citizens understand that when they drink a bottle of water and they don't recycle it properly, it ends up in our rivers and it ends up in our oceans and it ends up being microplastics again in our system. So what I've tried to do as well is teach people that all this in the end boils down to quality of life and numbers. We're doing a big push, for example, to ramp up solar and to ramp up wind in Colombia, but we're not doing it because it reduces the global emissions. We're doing it because it's good business. It makes more sense to do it that way than to keep building the hydroelectric plants because they offset each other. And in the end, it's cheaper than running gas and running coal. So we're doing it because it's good business. And while at the same time, it's helping the environment. Just to give you an idea, the worst quality of air in South America right now is the Amazon basin for cities, not for the Amazon per se, but cities in the Amazon, most are not interconnected. So that means they use diesel to power their cities. At the same time, they cook with a lot of wet wood and improper wood, which pollutes the air. And that means that people in the Amazon get sick a lot more by things that have to do with air quality than in other places in South America. So cities like Manaus in Brazil has one of the worst air qualities in South America. The same Leticia, the capital of the Amazon state in Colombia. So we're looking at how, for example, can we take a solar plant and batteries there? It's cheaper because we don't have to fly in or take a ship with diesel into the city. And at the same time, it'll help their health and it'll help their emissions.
Let's stay on that because this kind of last piece of we do renewable energy, we do wind and solar, and you started working on that as mayor. You're developing the first offshore wind farm off the coast of Barranquilla, expanding solar infrastructure. So I appreciate how you're speaking about it. And I think it comes back to the beginning of this conversation because as a mayor, you have to be very practical minded. You are dealing with real problems, and it's really like the buck stops with mayors. You can't then pass the problem along to someone else. There is nobody else. Let's talk through some of the initiatives that you worked on as mayor. Because it goes to this theme also of adaptation and nature, some of the nature-based solutions that you focused on. I know whether it was mangroves or estuaries and tropical forest. I know you have won awards for work you've done. I'm probably going to say it wrong on Todos al Park, or is that?
Todos al Parque.
Oh, okay, pretty close. Okay, so walk us through nature-based solutions and what you were working on and implementing during your time as mayor.
So one of the things that really excited me, and I started as a public official, then I ramped it up as mayor, was convincing people that we needed a lot of trees and that this was going to be a concerted effort and that we were going to spend a lot of money on this. I remember that when we started, we looked to Tampa, which was a sister city, and we saw how they managed their urban forests and also how they managed their parks. Then we went and we looked at New York's organization. And we went to London and we looked at how they managed their urban forest and looked at a study that London had done, which gave me a lot of insight because London said a tree-lined street has 15% higher property values than an untree-lined street. And that to me was a game changer, because then I said, oh, this is a way that I can talk economical sense to the people that don't understand nature. So I can say, if I have 15% higher property because I planted trees properly, then that means that I can charge 15% higher property taxes. So it's good business to plant trees. It will make my city more attractive, and it will give me the opportunity to do other things. But at the same time, if I plant trees, I'm going to have a lot more shade, which means that I will have the ability to reduce the consumption of energy in a lot of these homes, and we'll be able to adapt to climate change. And at the same time, and this was something that was an afterthought, but it actually helped us, if I really plant trees in the city, then something that's going to happen is that the absorption rate of the increased rainfall is going to be lower into our rain flood system, which at the time we had to build because it didn't exist. So we were spending more than $1 billion in the last 15 years creating canals that would drain the flood waters from our city. And the great thing is, because we're planting a lot more trees, the absorption rate of that rain that falls into the cement is lower because there's a canopy of leaves that's holding it for a while, and then it trickles down instead of just coming down right away. This is common sense, but it's actually science. So all these things happened because of planting trees. So what we did was we formed a public-private partnership, a company called Siembra Barranquilla, which is just plant. And it's basically a company that created a municipal nursery. We have 18 types of trees that we plant. And when they're at least 9 feet tall or 3 meters tall, when they have the certain circumference in their stem and they're ready to be planted, we take them and we plant them all over the city. We even give them to citizens, and we maintain them for a while. So it's an infrastructure project. And we also sell them to urban developers. And this is a project that's 65% owned by the city, 35% owned by private owners that had that business before. So in the end, what we did was we put forward and into center place the fact that we were going to do this. And at first, I remember I got a lot of flack or a lot of publicity from our opposition because they said, we can't believe you're spending this much money on trees and in greening the city. But once we got started, everybody wanted their block and their park and their neighborhood to look as nice as the one next to them. And that became a revolution.
I love that. We actually did a show, it was probably 6 months ago, with a researcher from the U.S. Forest Service, an economist who looks at that linkage that you're describing and studies in Portland. And now the linkages that are showing in certain places where there are more trees, like children's leukemia, those rates go down, asthma goes down, all these other co-benefits around health because you're getting more exposure for your immune system, and then the economic benefits too. And in fact, we now live in a place that's very close to the coast in South Carolina, and I think we moved here. Maybe my wife has a different view because there's a lot of trees that like run right up to the ocean, which I really appreciate. One of the things that I'd also read in the greening initiative with trees is creating an initiative to have residents co-design parks. What was that about?
So one thing that we started doing a lot is I talked to a lot of people, and we learned a lot from very good city planners and mayors. And one of the things that we learned, for example, is that a lot of times they did great things, but they didn't talk to the citizens. And the great things that they did took longer to be understood or to be used, or some great things were never appropriated fully with or by the community. So one thing that started with my team and I quickly took up on is that you have to listen and you have to ask. So that social listening and that idea of co-creating things, we developed it into a model to always have small iterations of things, not build everything all at once. So, for example, we were building our boardwalk, which was an adaptation because we needed to raise the level from the river so that we wouldn't have floods. But at the same time, we were going to give the city 5 kilometer long and more than 250-meter wide public space. So it was a park, it was a boardwalk, it was a place to eat, it was a place to meet. The city didn't have that in front of the river, but it was a huge park. And instead of building it out right away, we started out with the first 500 meters or half a kilometer. And we asked people, what would you like to see there? And then when that was done and they were using it, you start asking them, what would you like to see in the next 2 kilometers? And then you start adapting and changing and making sure that's what they want. And then when the next 2 kilometers were done, we do the same thing for the next two. And then you get something that is really appropriated and used. And that's what we did with more than 300 parks that we've done across the city. The differences on the parks are astounding because, for example, in one park, there's a sport called boccia, which I didn't even know. And there was a small park that we were building. And a lot of these citizens around the park said, we want boccia to be center stage there. And then we learned that this community had a lot of people, a lot of kids that couldn't walk. They were part of a system or a teacher that taught them how to play this sport because they had disabilities and they were a team of kids that had organically moved to that neighborhood and they played that sport there or their parents took them there to practice. They didn't have a formal court. So we built the court and this was a community ask. So the community wanted to support them. And we built this court for them and they started practicing there. And then we got the Parks and Recreation Department to actually sponsor the teacher. And they ended up winning a lot of tournaments nationally. But all this started because we listened to the community. And that is an example of something that happened 300 times in every neighborhood in the city. And you would at first get them to co-design the park with you. So you would bring ideas and they would say, no, I want this here, I want this there, I don't want this at all. Then you would get people to be part of the audit committee. So you would create a community audit committee while the park was being constructed. And then afterwards, we create the Pro Park Committee, in which we say, now you have to make sure that this park stays beautiful for the next 30, 40, 50 years. But also you have to make sure that we are bringing the social services to the park that the citizens need. So we want to make sure that you're helping us understand what the community needs. And that means at 6 a.m., you'll get an aerobics teacher. And then you'll have the elderly Zumba classes and hopefully the place where they can have light meals in the morning. And then we'll have classes for the kids and we'll have the carnival meetings at night so you can practice how you're going to dance in carnival. So it's all about making sure that the park is not a place where we built it and then we forgot it and then the community has to figure it out. Is how do we make sure that it becomes a focal point of social and community life? And that in turn has made the parks safer. So building a park means safety because a lot of people are using it 24/7. And at the same time, it means economic development around the park so that the stores and the restaurants start selling more. And that means that the park, after a couple of years, and I'm talking 8 to 9 years, the park pays for itself. So it's actually a good business to invest in regreening the spaces, in giving the community a place to interact, because they come out of their house. And it also means less health costs, as you know, because we're getting people to be out and about. So it's all what I call a virtuous cycle.
You've won a number of awards. Your work has been recognized as an OECD champion mayor for inclusive growth. And as I hear you talking, that sounds very much like this is, whether it's the parks or other things you've done, there is this notion of inclusivity really built into how you approach the job. When we had a chance to talk to Mayor Rodas from Quito, and he talked about a park that he had built, saying, we built the best running track in the city. And so it didn't matter if you were rich or poor, like if you were going to train, you wanted to train in the park. And it was this world-class kind of luxury public good. And in many respects, it sounds like the way that you approach what a city can do for its citizens is to deliver services or world-class amenities that people are going to want to be there sort of no matter their socioeconomic status, that this is just because it's of such a high quality that it really elevates everyone in the city. Is that something you think about?
Yes. And I remember when we started building the parks, the first park that was made, and this was a team member of mine that worked in the city for a long time as well. He got into his head, like, I want to do the best parks possible. And he, for
Yeah.
example,
Okay.
we were bringing in at first, we didn't have in Colombia, they weren't making good elements for parks, like good seesaws. So we were bringing them from Chattanooga, from Tennessee, which were indestructible. Because what we said is, we want they don't have a good relationship with parks because most parks in Colombia and in Barranquilla, you would build it, and after a couple of years, it would be like gone, deteriorated. The swings would no longer be there. That it would be barren land. So what can we do to make this thing like indestructible? And we started bringing in, for example, indestructible slides and indestructible swings and all these things. But at the same time, I remember when we inaugurated the first park and did all the community outreach, etc. The first park, we saw a lot of people that would vandalize it. And at the same time, you would see them. Carlos remembers somebody was taking like a plant and they were taking it home. And he stopped the person. He asked, like, why are you doing this? And he says, because why not? It's going to be gone tomorrow. So if I don't do it, somebody else will. And that was the idea of what would happen when you built something in the community. And the idea also was that public officials didn't maintain things. They were good at cutting the ribbon, but they weren't good at making sure things stayed. So the next day, we replanted everything, we fixed the park up, and the park was there. And then the next day, it was there, and it was there, and it was there. So it's the idea of the broken window, but on the reverse, is like, we're going to make sure that this park is shining. And we started something that we didn't understand at the time, but we started what we call the guardaparques, which are sort of like the stewards of the park. And they're the guys and the women that have to maintain our green system, but they also paint the fence and they also mend and work on everything. So we have more than 800 people that work on this. But in the sense, this started, and then the first one became known like, okay, nobody's gonna, this is ours. We need to make sure we use it properly because it's not going away. And this was the first one. And it was in I would say, it's not the wealthiest neighborhood. It was a mid-tier neighborhood, it's socioeconomically speaking. But then we said, look, the second one, we're going to put it in one of the most violent neighborhoods in the city. And then people were like, nah, that's not going to work. That's it. That's the park program. And that park has been there for 15 years or 14 years. And it's beautiful. It gets a lot of use from 5 a.m. to like 12 p.m. People play sports in it. People play dominoes. You see it, and it's alive, and it's part of the community. And it's one of the most iconic parks right now. It's called Parque Las Nieves because that's what the community is called. And it worked because we were able to work with the community and tell them, we're going to give you the best park possible. And the beauty of that is that you saw other neighborhoods in the city, high affluent neighborhoods, say, I want a park like the one at Las Nieves. I want the great artificial turf so that my kids can play 24/7. And I'll give you two small anecdotes. One is we went to an urban development that was being built at the time, and it was already consolidated. And it was one of the highest per square foot or meter property values in the city. And we said, we're going to fix the park that they did a couple years ago for you in the development. And they said, no, we don't want a lot of things that you're putting up in other parks, because since there are not a lot of parks, what's going to happen is people are going to come to our neighborhood. So we just want more trees and wider lanes to just walk and jog on, etc. 5 years later, they came back to the city and they said, we're ready because the parks are so beautiful elsewhere that now we're ready for a park like the ones you're building. And one day, somebody that worked for me at the city came over smiling, and he said, I was just at the country club, like the nicest place in town where everybody wants to be, etc. And they were having like this town hall meeting, and they were saying that they could not believe that the parks for children, the municipal and the city parks, were so much better than the ones they had at the country club. So they were going to ask for help from the city so that we could teach them and tell them how they could build something for their kids. So those things really taught us that when you build quality spaces in every part of the city. A, citizens will appreciate it, they will use it properly. But B, they become places where citizens meet. And that's equality. And that's something that Enrique Peñalosa, ex-mayor of Bogota, has said a lot, is when you give people the ability to meet in public spaces and to use them properly, you are breaking barriers, but you're reducing the cost of being poor or not having or being challenged economically at a time, because you can share a space with a person that has the most money in the city, and you're observing and you're being and you're using the same space, and that is equality.
That is equality. I love all of that. The researcher I mentioned had talked about too, where there were more trees in neighborhoods. So he did this longitudinal 30-year study in Portland, Oregon, because there was a nonprofit that had the data of where they'd put trees around the city for 30 years. Now they've seen over time there's more civic engagement. That there's actually correlates to higher voting turnout. And when I asked the researcher, he said, I would attribute that to you are more connected to your neighbors, you're more connected to your community, you're just more connected, you're more staked in what's happening, and you participate more. So that's amazing, Jaime. The question that I wanted to ask, just hearing this, is, so years ago, I worked in economic development for the city of Asheville, North Carolina. And I was working on startups. That's kind of my thing. I was doing the startup strategy. But I went with the team to Nashville, Tennessee, to understand their kind of the economic growth sort of miracle as they transformed their city, right? And you'd spent time there. And they asked one of the city leaders, I don't remember what his exact title, I can't remember exactly who he was, but they said, how'd this happen? Like, how did you get all this stuff now? Like, how did you become not just a country music town? And he said, I attribute most of it to building the stadium for the NFL football team. And he said, and the reason why is because we went from thinking ourselves as kind of small and provincial to, wow, we can do big things. We can do the biggest things. And it's different, but I wonder when an initiative like this or something happens across your city and people start to maybe think about their city differently or what's possible in their city, do you see kind of maybe a culture shift or a mentality shift that says, well, what else can we do here in Barranquilla? We've done this wonderful thing. Maybe it opens our horizons to other things. We can maybe think bigger about what our future can be.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a study that Johns Hopkins Institute for Government Innovation did called Trust. How does trust come into play to create great cities and to create virtuous cycles? And they did a study on Barranquilla and what happened. And I think in the end, when you are able to do things that change the way that the citizens and also the country and people around see your city, they start to believe and they start to get vested into the next big thing. So when we started, I said we were a bankrupt city, nobody trusted us. And I remember that when you paid the first bills that you paid, your taxes, we would give you a wristband that said, thank you for believing. And then it was just like, thanks for doing your job as a citizen. And then we would really show you what we did with that money. Like right away, we would do something that you said like, wow, these people are really working. And then we started doing other things. And as Nashville, we said, we want to, for example, develop our riverfront, but we want to create jobs. So we built our expo center. And I was actually the manager of that project. And we built up a huge and very modern expo center that gave us the opportunity to start bringing in a lot of business tourism. And then it was like, wow, that could be done. But then if we're bringing in business tourism, we can bring in shows, we can bring in entertainment, we can bring in sports. So then we said, why don't we bring the Central American Games to Barranquilla? And we were able to tackle that, and it worked. And then we said, why don't we start, when I was running for mayor, I said, I want to build a 1,000-hectare eco park that reclaims our mangrove system, that cleans up an estuary and a swampland that we have. And I want to make it so that it can have 5 kilometers of boardwalks around it. And I remember people looking at me from my team like, wow, I don't know if we can do that. And I said, well, we've done a lot of things before. And I went to the citizens and I went to a lot of businessmen and whatnot. And everybody's like, wow, yeah, it makes sense. And we made a study and we said, if we do this, this also makes economical sense because we will bring in nature tourism, ecotourism, we will bring in better quality of life, etc. And within 4 years, it was built, and it's now a beautiful park. It's a place where people meet with nature, and they didn't know that they had. And I think that in the end, what you're saying is true. People start to see that you're a city that's going places, that's not static, that's daring to give opportunity. And when people feel that, you start to get a lot of migration from other cities of people that are looking for opportunities because they're saying people there are making risks, they're taking risks, they're investing, they are opening their minds. So that means I'm going to find the place. And I remember a few years ago, one of the biggest CEOs of one of the biggest companies in Colombia, he was quoted saying, if I was 18 years old, I would move to Barranquilla because that is today the land of opportunity. And that is what I think that virtuous cycle creates.
It's fantastic. So I want to shift gears. Your term as mayor ended, I believe, in 2023. And you have since, you're now involved, I know, with a number of different engagements. You're involved with an initiative called Breathe Cities, right? That brings together, pools a lot of resources to work with cities globally. You've talked also about the need for for mayors to be heard more and participate in kind of where capital is flowing in terms of climate finance and how projects are getting financed that cities need. That's how we've actually connected, and it's through the SDSN, Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance. It's a long title, but my interpretation is, how do we come together, get the brightest minds thinking about moving more capital to the places that are on the front lines of climate so that they can implement kind of the next generation climate investments and projects, right, for mitigation and adaptation. Let's talk about some of that work, and let's talk about how you're engaging in terms of whether it's taking what you've learned as mayor or what's core to you and what you want the world and other cities to be able to do. How are you engaging in that way?
I think there's two versions of what needs to be done. One is what's going on in the global north and what would go on in developing countries. And I think what I've tried to do is share my path towards a city that found a way to adapt and mitigate, understanding that nobody was going to give us anything for free, that we can't sit down and wait for development finance and the world to just figure it out for the first time in the world and then put up the money that's never going to be put up. So what we did was we were able to solidify our tax base. We were able to prop up our own generation of capital. And we got very creative with the development banks, and we started using new mechanisms to finance ourselves. But in the end, it was never enough. And in the end, we are an outlier. We are a city that has done it differently, but a lot of cities don't have the capacity or the luck or the confluence of things that happened that permit it. I mean, we are the oddball. And you can do a certain number of things that can replicate, but I don't think it'll be at scale. So the idea is, how can we get a lot more money into the things that are needed that make economical sense, social sense, and environmental sense? Because one thing that needs to stop being contentious is when you're talking about climate investments, this is not something for the world and to feel good about ourselves and to think that this has no real impact on the economy or on health or on people. This is saving lives. This is reducing costs of health. This is creating jobs. So it is good business to think about this. And if we're going to think about it cruelly in the bottom line, it makes sense to observe it and to fix it and challenge it. And it does not make sense to bury your head in the sand because you're going to get hit. So just to give you an example, insurance prices are going to be through the roof if we don't adapt and mitigate to climate change. And a lot of people are going to feel that. So anyway, I think the idea behind it is, if you are a city in a developing world, you either don't have access to finance, proper finance, or the interest rates that you're paying and the tenures of your loans are very different from the ones that you're getting in Asheville or in New York. So a city in South America can be paying 12, 14, 15% interest rates. And the maturity on their loan can be 10, 12, 14 years. While as a muni bond in the US can be 5, 6, at top 7%. And you can hold a muni bond for more than 20 years, 25 years. So that's the difference in financing. You're paying more than two and a half times more, and you're having to repay that loan a lot quicker. So how do we make the world understand the risks of investing in cities is sometimes lower than investing in their countries? And at the same time, if we create a model where people understand those risks and we hedge against them and we give them the opportunity to be lowered by creating guarantee funds or things like that, then we will get capital flowing into these cities. And the cities will have the ability to prop themselves up, not because you're giving them a gift, but because they're making better use of financing. And at the same time, making a call to the development community to say, let's stop thinking of everything as a gift and let's just create, I would say, capacity building in the ability to create projects that are meaningful and deliver them, but B, also understanding and giving cities the ability to become more financially and fiscally savvy so that they can make these decisions and prop themselves up by their own bootstraps. So in a sense, that's what I've tried to bring to the table, is that idea that this is not an idea of giving everybody free handouts. It's how do we mobilize capital in a smart way, and how do we reduce the uncertainties and the risks of investing in Africa, Asia, and places like South America, where it becomes good business for the bankers of the world to say, we're going to mobilize more money there.
That makes a ton of sense to me. I can see why you would be highly visible in that conversation. One, because just hearing you, having this chance to have had this conversation with you, you are clearly someone who takes action and can bring people to a consensus view that they might not have in the beginning of a project, but come to see ultimately, oh, yes, this turns out to be a really excellent idea. And so you have that record, of course, that backs up what you're saying. I'm curious because I know that this is a topic, climate finance for cities, that I do think is getting more visibility, certainly not enough visibility. We've been learning about it, learning about why the structural constraints on cities in terms of being able to access capital, the lack of understanding, as you just said, necessarily that, okay, if I'm a banker in Switzerland and I think, well, what's the big deal? It's easy for cities to access low interest rate capital over long terms and without necessarily having an understanding of what happens in other parts of the global south or in parts of Southeast Asia or where have you. I've seen press releases lately of, we had a meeting, multilateral development banks, we had a meeting. We're meeting, and the press release is about the fact that we had a meeting, and it was a really good meeting. And I wonder, for you, I can guess, but you as a mayor and other mayors, where you have to move a process that moves slowly, right? And you're trying to move it quickly because the challenge is urgent. How do you think about that dynamic? And do you see progress happening? Are you hopeful? Are you excited about where we are and what's coming up? Or what does that look like?
I think people are slowly starting to get it. And there are some examples, and I will tell you some banks that really get it. For example, the French Development Agency. When I was mayor, I worked very closely with them, and they loaned us about 170 million euros. And we were able to structure with them the first loan that was done long-term, and it had a synthetic currency swap. So what that means is that the loan was done in euros, but then immediately swapped into Colombian pesos and loaned directly to the city without a sovereign guarantee, without having to go through Colombia, and it was loaned to us. And it was an indicator-based loan. And that is very important because normally development banks don't loan for budget projects. So they will loan, for example, and they'll say, I'll finance that project, but I won't give you money so that you can spend in your development plan. That they do for countries. But what happens is, in the development finance world, from the day that you say, I want the money, to the day that you get it, it can be 3 to 4 years. So a mayor has 4 years. So if you give me a budget-based loan, then I can start building things. I can start working, and then I'll get the money and I'll rearrange my finance. But if you say, I won't give you the money for that project until I give you the money for the project, that means I can't do anything for 3 to 4 years. So the AFD was able to shift their mindset, and they adapted. And I've become a very great friend of the president, Renewal, the president of the AFD. And he has a beautiful phrase that he said, when I came over, I said, I want to be the bank that's on the other side, because we work for our clients, which are cities and governments and people. So we have to be on their side, make sure that we take care of the money that we loan, but we have to have their perspective. So he's very much at the forefront of this idea, and he's on our commission because of his way of thinking. But then that gave me a great opportunity, because I got a loan from the Interdevelopment Bank. And it was the first time they were loaning to a city directly in a couple of decades. And I took 3 years to get the loan. I had to get a sovereign guarantee. And at the end of the day, I was getting the loan. It was the interest rate was very low. It was a fantastic loan. But they wanted to give me a loan for projects. And when I finally got the money, I told them, I've already built these projects. So either we change the way we work with this loan, or I can't use the money. And it was a big back and forth. And in the end, they said, we've never loaned to cities this way. We only loan to countries that way. So the status quo is always beneficial for countries, but it's not for cities. So we were able to challenge it, because in the end, I needed the money, but I knew I didn't need it with the strings attached. And they changed, and they gave us the opportunity to make it an indicator-based loan. And that changed the whole ballgame. So I do think that things like that are happening, but they need to happen quicker, and they need to be the norm. So one thing that we're trying to do, and I don't know if Mauricio Rodas mentioned it, is create a guarantee fund. So that fund, the idea is that it will make loaning to cities by the private sector a lot less risky, because you will have a guarantor that will say, if you go through me, I can hedge the risk of loaning to a city that you don't know or understand. And the idea is that hopefully these banks and these funds and these pension funds will start loaning, and they will use the fund the first, the second, the third, the fourth time. But by the fifth, they'll say, I understand this market now. I understand my clients now, and I will loan to them without needing this guarantee fund. So as you said, we're people of action, because a mayor has to act. So what we've done is, within the commission, we said, let's start and let's build this guarantee fund. So we're working on creating a real world working example of something that can positively move the needle into climate finance into cities. So that's one of our actions. And the other one is working with the private sector to make it more sustainable and more enticing to invest there. So working with banks, working with private institutions. And the third wheel is really trying to convince the development bank world that this needs to change. So how do we get them to become more open to this change? Because they are also institutionalized in a sense. So how do we rock the boat in a good way?
So some of this is, let's go to the private sector and the private banks, and let's have this more direct relationship. Yeah. Some of it is, can we put some mechanisms in place, like a guarantee fund, to give everyone a comfort and exposure and recognize that these are, investment grade projects, they're investment worthy, they're bankable, we can do this. And then the other is to go to the system as it stands today, the institutions that are in place, where the boards overseeing those, the governing bodies, are countries, yeah, right? And trying to, shift the dynamic where there may be some vested interests that are pretty comfortable with the way the system, but operating on multiple levels to push and make progress. Is that an accurate way to
yes,
summarize that?
And I think that the other thing that we've tried to do in the commission, and the Secretariat has done a great job, is to include a lot of these actors within the commission. So the people that are the development banks or the people that are the private sector are sitting there with us, hearing these debates, and they are understanding our plight as well. So a lot of mayors that sit there, can say firsthand what's going on, and that development banks are hearing them and saying, oh, the things aren't as kosher as we always thought they were.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, it's been amazing for us to be able to work with the Penn Institute for Urban Research and to get connected to the Secretariat and this initiative. And it's been incredible to have an opportunity to speak with you, truly to hear your story and the work you've done as mayor, what you're doing now, post-mayor on the global stage. So thank you so much for spending time today with us at Supercool. And we are very excited to see where you go, what happens next. I'm sure it will be great to continue to follow you.
Thank you, Josh. It's been a pleasure. It's always nice to talk about things that give us hope and that show us that there is a way, and that there are more things that unite us, and that, as you said, in the city space, we don't have time to talk about silly politics. Just get things done and help people and make sure that we all live better.